Hi guys. So I want to first just sort of go over how you might start a painting. So you may or may not have done this before, but I want to show you kind of a traditional way of starting a painting. So first I'm going to go over the materials I've got. I've got one kind of each primary color. So I have my quinacridone magenta and my cadmium red. I have my Prussian blue and my ultramarine blue. You can also switch Prussian out for phthalo blue. I've got my, let's see, this one should be an Indian yellow, but I've got a yellow medium and a yellow light. So you can see one is a lot more orange and one is a lot more green. I've also got some white, and you can also trade out this yellow medium for my Indian yellow, which is like the best color ever. And those are the main colors I'm going to focus on today. If you have a brown, that's also great. But also white is pretty important. I'm going to have a couple of brushes standing by, and I also have a sheet of palette paper. So I did a bit of sketching, and a lot of the time when I'm doing thumbnail sketches for a painting, I like to just start with one color and kind of get a sense of value, because it's true that value is going to be the most important aspect of your painting. So this process helps you think about the most general things first, and then you'll get into the details later on. So I decided this sketch is what I'm going to go with for this painting. And so I'm going to show you how I'm going to create an underpainting and then slowly build it up into a more finished painting. So what I've gotten a sense of here is sort of a landscape or maybe a seascape going back with some smaller things in the distance, some foregrounded things that are a little bit more, feels kind of like a tornado, but also feels kind of like a creature of some kind. And then maybe like a rock formation or something related to this figure over here on the right side. And then I've decided to have sort of this veil over the sort of corner of the page. So this is a section where I want to show you how you can use transparencies in your painting. That's always a really exciting and challenging thing to do, is to paint an object seen through something else. So you might not be ready for that if this is your first painting, but I'm going to show you how you might do it just so you have more ideas going forward. So the first step of a painting, for the most part, is normally an underpainting. There's millions of ways to make paintings, but I'm going to show you a traditional technique that sort of makes it easier for you along the way. So I've put some Indian yellow right here, and I might add a little bit of a couple of other colors just to make an interesting starting point for my painting. So I want to make a neutral tone that's pretty warm and yellow. So I'm going to put just a tiny dot of blue, maybe a tiny dot of my quinacridone magenta. Okay. So next I'm going to mix this color up with my palette knife. And one thing that's really important to remember is that your underpainting, for the most part, it should be pretty transparent and pretty light. So notice as I'm moving this paint across my palette paper, how transparent that is. So you can really see that white right through it. And I really like starting with thin, transparent tones and then building my way up to thicker tones. And if you're doing something like oil painting, this is really, really important. But at the same time, you know, there's lots and lots of ways to work with acrylics. So acrylics are incredibly versatile, which is why I love working in them. So what I'm going to do with my underpainting is I'm going to dip my brush in water, and I'm going to kind of water down this color I just made. And this is the only time in my painting process that I'm going to water down my paint. Every other time, so after this layer, everything needs to be sealed in with a medium or straight up paint, or else my pigment will slowly start to pick up off the page. So I want to make a pretty thin sort of wash of this color. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my sketch, and I'm just going to jot in the really, really important things that I see. So I'm starting with just the major shapes of value, some major contour lines, but I'm not focusing on outline. I'm focusing on value. So sometimes I really need to use the flat side of my brush here. Sometimes I might want to use this end of the brush. So I recommend getting a couple brushes that are really versatile. So this one, it's pretty flat, but at the same time, you can get a really nice fine line with it. But I can also, work on it flat like this to get a really thick line. So I'm going to map some things out. And I really love painting water. One trick I always do in painting water or landscapes to add depth is just making the lines that you use get closer together and thinner as they get closer to the horizon line. I might start to think a little bit more critically about what some of these sections should be and where they should be as far as value goes. But generally I'm thinking that the light source is coming from sort of back here, maybe behind this little web or net here. And then the shadows are going to cast in the opposite direction from there. So you can go ahead and start to map in those most important aspects of your lighting situation. So where's the lighting coming from and where are you going to have the most intense shadows? Okay, it kind of looks like a wave a little bit. I'm also thinking it'll kind of transform into something else. Painting this kind of like otherworldly landscape is one sort of approach, but at the same time, the things I'm showing you, you could do the same thing with a portrait, with a still life, with an abstract idea. So just mapping out the most general things first is incredibly important. So you never want to jump too quickly into the detail. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start to work out my color scheme a little bit. So typically with acrylic painting, I really like to start with the things that are furthest back, put them in there first, and that way I can sort of build things up right on top, which will solidify some of those figure-ground relationships. So I might go ahead and decide on a tone for this sky back here, paint that in so I don't have to worry about it. So this is kind of like a Bob Ross technique. If you ever want to like learn another way of making a painting, Bob Ross is incredible. And he always works from back to front. And he's working with oils, so it's a little bit different. But I think I'm going to make a color that's kind of complementary to this because I already really love this like bold amber color. And I think that I want my color scheme to go somewhere along those lines. And hopefully you've mapped out a little bit of your color as already. But just one thing I want to mention is if you are scared to go in with a brush and paint in your underpainting, it's totally fine. But try to go in with something that's not a pencil if you choose to draw something in. So something like this soft pastel, it's like really, really easy to paint over. It's also really easy to incorporate into your painting process. And then you can always just wipe it away because soft pastels are like really, really impermanent. So something to think about. Using like a watercolor pencil, a water-soluble pencil is always nice. But I think I might start to mix a color for the sky by adding a little bit of this color that's already there. So once you find like a color you're in love with, sometimes you might want to make it so that that color kind of dominates the painting. So this color, which is a combination of Indian yellow and quinacridone magenta. It's a really, really beautiful, bright, almost like vermilion color. So I'm going to add some of this with some blue because this vermilion color is very, very orange. And so if I add some blue to it, it will neutralize the orange in it almost instantly. A lot of the time when we're, choosing our favorite color or, making color decisions, we're really just choosing like, I like purple, so I'll make it purple. But in fact, the kind of purple that you have and what's close by to the purple is going to make a huge difference. So you always want to think about, you know, the really, really specific relationships within your painting. It's all about relationships, similar to a lot of other parts of life. So it's all about context and thinking about how something works within the space that it's in. But, you know, one thing to keep in mind is that, like, this is the very first layer. A lot of this might be covered up really, really quickly. So, you know, I could even consider this still part of my underpainting. And I hope to talk to you guys about using using opaque tones as well as transparent tones to get different effects. So you can really adjust paint to be as opaque or transparent as you want, as long as it's a transparent pigment. Some pigments that you have will be a little bit more opaque. So like this quinacridone magenta is super transparent. You know that because on the back, or, you know, sometimes it's on the front, you see this open square. On something that's a lot more opaque, like this cadmium red light, I have this square that's filled in black. And that's how you know that it is, in fact, super, super opaque. So you can't really create a glaze with that. I mean, you can if you add enough medium, but it's not going to be quite as transparent as I'd like to get with my glazes. So I have a section of this that's a little bit more blue. I really love in a painting when a color, especially something that's supposed to be really subtle, like a background, subtly shifts in tone as it moves across. So one thing I want to think about is that my light source, I was thinking it should be right here. So I should maybe, instead of going too crazy with that blue, should maybe move some of that over and then add a bit more yellow or white to brighten it up a little bit. Okay. All right, so here I have some glazing medium. So this is an acrylic medium that you can use to thin out your paint. It also, this glazing medium is really glossy. So one of my very favorite tricks to do is to put a layer of gloss medium over an entire painting in between each layer. And what it'll do is it'll kind of create this effect as if you're looking through a prism. So what I would do is just pour a bunch here, stroke it with a big brush across. But now I think I'm going to go through with some of this just straight up magenta. And I'm going to add a little bit of a glaze over top of some of these areas. So anytime you thin down your acrylics using a glazing medium, something that will add a little bit of sheen but is also super transparent, it can be called a glaze. So you can see that there's sections you can see through this section I'm painting. And maybe I want to also do an Indian yellow glaze. Indian yellow is one of my very favorite colors to glaze with. I need to make sure I clean off my brush really nicely because it's true that it will seep in really quickly. So with this transparent Indian yellow, I can just glaze over this whole thing if I want to. And what that's going to do is it'll make it so all the colors beneath it are in harmony. So even if I had like blue under there, so which is actually something I might do, let's grab something a little bit cooler. And instead of using my Prussian blue this time, I'm going to use my ultramarine. So the reason why you have multiple colors is you're going to get a lot more complexity if you're not just mixing from the same set of tones. That being said, sometimes having a limited palette can also be really exciting and fun to do. But I think I will scoop some of this magenta over here. And on this dried area of my palette, I'm going to make, hopefully, a nice purple. This is ultramarine, quinacridone magenta, and white. And I want this to be pretty neutral. So what I'm going to do is reach across the color wheel, grab a complement. I think I might just take this right into my white to lighten it up. A bit more blue and maybe some yellow. So that yellow and purple are complementary. So whenever you have a color that you want to tone down just a bit, just grab a little bit of the complement. So just grabbing a little bit of yellow is a perfect move if I want to make this a more toned down purple. All right. So this purple is definitely still brighter and less neutral than my background, so it'll still stand out pretty nicely. But, you know, let's say the light's coming from over here. I might want to push in some interesting, cool shadows over here. And I'm also going to kind of go over this edge, which should just generally be a little bit helpful in solidifying that figure-ground relationship. And I'm kind of making it a gradient from vibrant magenta down to this purple. Maybe I'll grab some of that original color I started with just to lay a really thick section in there. So I want you guys to think about painting thick, painting thin, but also like where do you need to do those? You know, so like this section here really feels like it's in shadow because of those cooler colors, but it also feels like it's really up close because of the thickness of the paint and the way that they're layered. All right. And I really like this color down here. And I might sort of make a shadow in the water also. This sort of light, it's almost like a periwinkle color. And while it looks looks pretty light on my palette, in context with this, it feels like it's pretty much like a mid-tone. So it sits in really nicely as a shadow. So one thing to think about in your painting is that if you go too crazy with mixing white with everything, it can really wash out your painting. So I recommend using white sparingly, because white, but also black, like black right out of the tube, can really kill your painting. So let's say I wanted to do like some really dark core shadows in black. If I mixed some of this quinacridone magenta with some ultramarine blue and some yellow, it would basically create a green and a purple, or sorry, a green and a red that are mixing together, canceling each other out chromatically to create a neutral. So that neutral would fit in way better with this color scheme than if I just grabbed black straight out of the tube. So here I'm just going to go over this edge and clean it up a little bit, make it a little bit more organic, and then I can go over that white and it'll be just as bright of a color. So if I want to do some transparent glazing over here, it's true that it needs to have a relatively light color underneath, or else it'll optically mix to create a really dark tone, which sometimes is what you really want to go for. Other times you might want to leave something white underneath so that those bright colors can sit on top. So sometimes when you're glazing, doing a preparatory pass with white can be like your saving grace. I also might add a couple highlights in here, and keep in mind that these will be painted over with transparent colors relatively soon. All right, so now that my white paint that I've added is dry, it's perfect time for me to go in with some glazing. So I'm going to use my glazing medium or your gloss medium. You can also use matte medium, although it's not quite as shiny, but it's all right. Thinking about glazing here, I feel like I kind of want to go back and forth between warm and cool. So far this is all so warm. I think that I might keep this relatively warm, and then I want maybe this web that I'm going to add to be a transparent, cooler tone. So I might start going in with some magenta, so some quinacridone magenta, and I might go ahead and just mix some of that with my Indian yellow because it's just such a lovely combination. And don't mix your paint like this, use your palette knife. Alright, so now I have this lovely color. I always try to test out my tones on a section of my palette before I really go for it, and I feel like I might need a little more magenta. Okay, so far I have a lot of opaque stuff, but adding a bit of my gloss medium here to this paint that I've mixed up will create a lovely transparent tone. And the more gloss you add, the more transparent it is. And I really recommend amping up the white sections that you know you need before you glaze. And that should help because overall glazing is going to push your painting down in value. So it'll become a darker painting if you were to glaze over the entire thing. So I like to start out relatively light just so that I can be in control of what's happening, because with acrylics it's true that once you start you're kind of you're going for it. So Indian yellow is just such a beautiful color to glaze with, and notice what color, so it'll kind of change this cool tone to something that's right in between the two, and that's something really magical to look out for. So that purple almost becomes like a greenish purple in certain sections. And I just love having different areas of my painting that sort of transition from being super duper opaque to being super transparent, and allowing colors to sort of transition over time depending on how the light is hitting them, depending on the positioning, but also to just give it more, I don't know, more of like a prismatic effect. So I really love working in gradients. So making something go from like one color into the next and blending along the way. I think because I'm, for the most part, I am pretty intuitive in my painting, and I let a lot of weird things happen. I think there's something nice about knowing you know, having some bit of control in a gradient, so allowing something to switch from one tone to the next. All right, and I feel like this little blob here does not have nearly the shadow that it needs. And because the light's coming from right here, it's going to hit it in a different spot than this one. I might also grab some of that pure magenta, and then, you know, maybe I'll go over and add a little bit more of a glaze over this later on. But you can glaze with light tones, you can glaze with dark tones. Glazing is like the most magical trick that once you figure out how to use it in your own way, it will really unlock like a whole nother sort of level of what kind of painting you can make. So I really recommend trying it out in many different circumstances. I think this needs a bit more of a bright highlighter on the edge. It's almost like it's glowing. All right, but and I haven't added any of this orange yet. So this is an opaque orange that I think is like kind of like an opaque version of some of these colors I already have here. Okay. And I do love painting wet on wet, so having a wet section of paint and just going right in and, you know, like this section right here is still wet with purple. I can go in with some orange, blend them together really quickly. This is something that you mostly want to do with oils, but at the same time, if you're a fast painter, you can totally get away with painting wet on wet with acrylics. And maybe some cool shadows in the water behind this little blob. I really love how these cool shadows look in the context of this bright orange here. And it's true that some things you want to let dry before you go back in. So like this gray tone that I'm adding to the water is going to be most effective if I allow those really warm tones to dry completely so I can get a really smooth line. I'm going to add some of my glazing medium to it. So I've mixed some ultramarine and some quinacridone magenta. Alright, that's a lovely color. So for this move, I think I want this to be like my tiny brush moment. So I want to make sure my brush is super clean. Alright. And you know what? I feel like a web might be a little bit too much. So instead, this one thing that I really love to do is to play with perspective by making little sort of strings that move forward and backward in the background. So I'm going to imagine that this section of this cloud, and I might just like paint it in a little darker just for the heck of it. So I'm going to imagine that this section, this is like the shadow under this main cloud right here. And I want it to be pretty subtle. So with my purple, I'm going to make it look like this string is coming out from underneath this cloud and then back behind this one here. So in painting in this way where you're really relying on the pressure of your brush, so I wish I had a brush with like one hair on it, but instead I'm using this one that's a little bit thicker. So I'm really gonna just hope for the best, but also don't be afraid to turn your piece around. Alright, so I have like a little rope going into the distance. Now I want it to look even tinier than that, and so I might now make it look like it's sort of coming down here. Maybe it's almost looks like it's like dripping into the ocean. Okay. And then one thing that I might do here is sort of go back with that cloud color and kind of reinforce the fact that that cloud is on top of that little string there. So I might need to remix up some of that grayish tone, which I know is a lot of Indian yellow, a lot of blue, and some magenta. So, oops, too much magenta. And don't forget to add white when you need to. And sometimes it's the case that you need to just kind of go back, remix it. Sometimes you don't know the color is right until it's in context with all the other colors in your painting, which, you know, can be kind of a pain, but at the same time, it's an important thing to think about. All right, so now that is totally in front of that little string that I just added. And I feel like it needs maybe some brighter highlights too. It's kind of like a stormy sky. All right, so I'm gonna zoom out. I feel like sometimes taking a look at a painting from further away or snapping a picture of it and looking at it tiny can be like exactly what you need. I'm gonna go ahead and tear off this tape so you can see why it is that I wanted a clean edge And why it is that I took my brush strokes all the way over. So you guys can paint on, for this project, you can paint on paper, you can paint on, you know, your clothes if you want, you can paint on wood, you can paint on plastic, you can paint on metal or glass. There's like endless opportunities. So hopefully you have what you need, and if you are working on with like a more limited palette, that's okay. But let me know how I can help you, because this is like my favorite thing to do ever, and I love talking to people about painting and seeing how other people have different approaches, because it's just like such a experiential sort of medium. Like you almost never know what it's going, like what the process will be like until you try it. So I'm really excited to see what you guys make. One more thing that I probably will add to this is a little bit of a highlight or a shadow on that little string there. So I might add some of this transparent color to my white and make like a light version of that purple, and then just like tap a tiny bit in there. So when you're painting, make sure you have what you need, make sure you are in a good mindset, but also I recommend making more paintings than you think you need, because like I've made like thousands of paintings in my life, and like half of them have been terrible. So just be ready for some things to, you know, not work out exactly how you might think, but at the same time, just know that, like, you know, making a painting that's like kind of ugly isn't the end of the world, and I'm also not going to fail you for it. So I definitely care more about you guys experimenting and trying new things than I do about you being like the perfect artist, because, you know, no, that doesn't even exist. So let me know how it goes, and good luck.